Fantastic to have you today. We've got the wonderful Dave Martin. How are you today, Dave?
I am peachy keen and raring to go.
Yeah, he's got his serious face on, he told me.
That's right.
Unfortunately, James is running late. Hopefully, he'll join us soon. He needed to make himself pretty before he could jump on. Look, if you're watching, of course, don't forget to join us at our Remote AF community, remoteaf.co. Click the community button. A lot of like-minded people talking about a lot of like-minded things. Second to that, watch out for the big announcement. As I said, the team here at Remote AF have been cooking something up, and very shortly in the next few weeks we'll be announcing that. And lastly, don't forget we've got a newsletter, Teamcraft. So make sure you subscribe for that. Details are in the show notes. It'd be fantastic to have you on that. Fantastic. Let's get started, Dave. We're talking about governing dynamically adaptive organizations, our favorite topic.
Always.
And particularly about transparency. And I think the question I asked you right at the beginning was, why transparency? Why do we want to be transparent?
Yeah, look, and there are a lot of good reasons for not being transparent. It's really good for job security if you're the only one who knows something. So it kind of does go against the grain a lot of the time, setting up a system of transparency in an organization. But I think the serious answer to the question is, there's a couple of types of transparency. There's kind of vertical transparency, so top of the organization to bottom of the organization, and there's the horizontal transparency, so between teams. And I know I stole that term from you, Tony. I can see it in your eyes. You're going, those are words that I've used before. Yeah. Let's start with vertical transparency because it's the one that everyone always thinks about.
Before we do, Dave, let me introduce you to James.
Oh, James.
G'day, how are you?
We weren't too rude about you while you weren't here.
No, James.
Excellent.
Yes.
I'm disappointed in you, but I also don't believe you, so that's fine.
So, James, we're talking transparency, and Dave was just about to elucidate whilst we ruminate, and then we can debate.
Excellent.
So I'm starting with vertical transparency. One of the main drivers for transparency is leaders have they've got a strategic intent, and they're trying to get that strategic intent implemented throughout the organization. One of the big problems leaders have is they lose sight of the execution of that strategic intent. And as soon as they lose sight of it, they tend to respond with control. So it's, what are you doing? I need to be in all the status meetings. I need to be in all the, you must give me all these reports, all these status reports, all this documentation, basically to see what's happening. So they're trying to create a system of transparency so they can see what's going on. If you've got a system that gives them that transparency so they can see exactly what's happening, then they will tend to respond not so much with control, but with allowing the teams to get on with the job. And conversely, you need the transparency about the strategic intent, because there's so many organizations where you go like 2 levels below the CEO and nobody knows what the strategy is. So people are going, well, I'm doing stuff, I don't know why. Or we think this is the right thing to do, but then the boss keeps telling us that it's the wrong thing to do. So there's an enormous amount of wasted time and wasted effort. And then it then of course drives more of this management control behavior because people aren't aligned with the strategic intent. So it's that vertical transparency that allows the organization to do that sort of distributed decision making, move the decisions down to where the information is, all that really good stuff. That really all hangs off transparency.
James, seems you've just jumped in. What's your thoughts on it?
Look, I agree with everything Dave said. For me, one of the reasons that those pillars of transparency are so tightly tied together, it's about how you set up your systems of information. It's about how you lead, right? So it's a culture of transparency that you need. So if people feel like, on the one hand, if people feel like they have a job because they understand the strategy and they can explain it to people, or they are the people in the middle who get things done, that sort of reduces transparency. if you've got, on the other hand, a culture where everybody's trying to make sure that anybody can get things done, and you've got a culture where all of the work is linked to the strategy, then you've got a culture that's encouraging transparency. And that's the sort of place where, in my experience, you get better outcomes. So when you're setting up governance, being that this is a conversation about governance, you want to be setting up governance in such a way that it's not, here's a special committee that are the only people that can decide things. But whenever possible, you want to err on the side of saying people understand the strategy, as Dave was saying, and therefore they can make the right decisions. And so if you do have a committee at all, you have a committee that's there to say, how did we make sure that they made the right decisions? How did we make sure that they had the information that they needed and the transparency that they needed, that they could understand the way to make the decision, sort of logic to use, because they understood the strategy, and they understood what was actually happening on the ground because they had the data, so they could make the best possible decision at the time, or close enough to best possible decision at the time. So for me, think about transparency as a cultural attribute first.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because a lot of organisations, they have almost that reverse culture. Is a culture of information hiding. So we don't want people to know what's going on in our teams or in our area, because someone will tell us that we're doing the wrong thing, or they'll take our budget away, or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of information that gets hidden. As one of my somewhat favourite expressions is, there's often this organisational turd polishing factory of things are, everyone knows that the project is really bad, but as it bubbles up through layers and layers of governance, it starts to look better and better. Oh, we can't call it red, but let's polish it up to it, like make it an amber, and then the next level up goes, oh, maybe it's not an amber, maybe it's really sort of a light green or something. And by the time it gets to the CEO, everything's fine, until the day that it's not. And a lot of that's because people are afraid of punishment or repercussion or whatever it might. No one wants to be associated with a red project, but you need that transparency in the organisation. You need that culture of information sharing, so that everybody's got the right picture of what's going on.
Let me pick up on that a little bit. So firstly, Dave, the technical term is excrement polishing. Let's move forward with that. And it goes to my analogy of the old watermelon project. Everybody knows that one, right? It's green is green, you drop it, it goes red. But it's the code brown that comes afterwards that everybody has to deal with, right? So that's what we want. We want to make sure that we're transparent so we don't get to that situation. But it was something you said before, right? So we're talking a lot about the vertical flow of information, and we're talking about the reality of that is you want to stop that bifurcation of knowledge where the people at the top know stuff, people in the middle know lesser stuff, and the people down the bottom tend to know nothing, right?
Yeah. Well, except that they know an enormous amount about a completely different domain, which is what's actually going on the ground.
Which what
then doesn't bubble back up. Yeah.
Which brings me to that question about the horizontal that you were talking about, right? The horizontal flow of information. So how does that work transparently? Because I think that's where it doesn't plug in, right? We have the vertical flow, and even when we get that working, it's that horizontal flow across all of the teams. Your thoughts, boys?
James, you want to pick this one up?
Yeah, so it's really important, again, that you have the culture of people sharing information. You have the culture of the cultural aspects of, well, how do we actually make sure these people are talking to each other, right? And what are the mechanisms that we have for getting people together? I think back to projects 20 years ago, more that I would be working on, where you'd just wind up having a coffee or a beer with someone who was working on a totally different team in that project, and you'd say, oh, this is not going that well over here. We think you guys are stuffing up. And they'd be like, well, we think you guys are stuffing up. And then you realize, oh, we should have been talking to each other all this time. And then I think of the sort of the best projects that I've worked on in that same period of time, where you'd sort of, you'd have a really clear idea of what you needed to do, and you'd kind of bring everybody together into a war room or something and say, right, this is the project center, and we're taking everything else off you folks, and we're putting all the information that we need all over the wall, and let's get on with just getting this thing done. you'd have people from all across the business, and you'd learn things about the organization that you didn't know otherwise. And you'd start with a really great sense of transparency, at least within that project, maybe not outside it. Maybe everything else is still the same in the organization that I was just talking about before. But having those lines of communication across teams is super important. And that's one of the reasons we've talked a lot about kind of the obeya constructs and how do you create that kind of war room idea or similar when you don't have a room, or you have a room but half the people are in a different country. So thinking about how do you create those lines of communication is really important right from the start of a project, piece of work, or if you have the luxury, from the start of creating the organization.
Yeah, you're right. Work does not happen in isolation. So, you have a team or a group that's working on a piece of work. They're going to have dependencies. They're going to have, stuff that they need other people in the organization to do. Often we find that's, stuff gets thrown over the fence. Nobody really knows what's going on. Everyone starts to go, well, it's your fault that it's not happening. And you can get a lot of conflict within the organization that way, and you get a really poor outcome.
Yeah.
But also, how many times have you walked into a big organization and found that they're doing the same thing 4 times?
Yeah.
So I've worked for I've been doing some stuff in government, and one department I found no fewer than, I think there were 3 completely separate whole of government data platforms being developed.
That sounds right.
And it's entirely because no one's talking to each other. This group is going, we don't have a data platform. Let's build a data platform. And while we're at it, let's make it a whole of government thing so everyone can use it, which is great. It's brilliant. Except somebody else over here is going, we don't have a data platform and nobody's building one. So let's build an all of government data platform. And so you've got 3 of these things that are sitting on completely different tech stacks that won't talk to each other. And then often the solution is, there's a lot of stuff hanging off each of these now. So let's build another integration layer over the top to join these 3 things together. And of course, you end up with 2 or 3 of those. And it's not just a government thing. You see this, any large company, there's always 3 or 4 different attempts to do exactly the same thing because the horizontal flow of information is just not there. And it's an enormous waste of time, effort.
So let's talk about that flow of information, and the big word I like at the moment is data lake, by the way. So there's a lot of information in that data lake, but nobody knows what it is. So if we bring that back and we're trying to share the information in a better way, the question I always get asked is, or I get told, is we can't share that information. It's sacred. Well, they don't need to know that. Or as we go further up the organizational layer, there are certain things that we can't tell people. What do we do about that, team?
Sometimes it is a legitimate thing. We can't share this data. It's customers' private data. It's HR data, whatever it might be. There is stuff that we just can't share, which is fine. But I think a lot of data, knowledge is power. People do want to hold on to their data, and particularly in organizations that don't have this culture of sharing, which is why the cultural piece is so important. It's the instinct is go, this is our data. I don't want to let somebody else have this. They might change it or mess it up or use it against us or whatever it might be. I think the thing is really building that culture. It's challenging that assumption that we can't share. So the assumption should be we can share and tell us why we can't, rather than we can't share and tell us why we can. And it really comes down to, as James said, it's building that culture of transparency and sharing across the organisation, and that is a challenge.
James?
And the other, what I'd add to that, I guess, is, there's reasons that concepts like radical transparency didn't really take off, because being radically transparent is sharing everything, and we don't share everything in our daily lives. It's not the nature of humans for really good reasons. But what we do want to do is, Well, I guess if you come back to sort of the example I was using before, if you've got people having conversations over a coffee or a beer or a Teams chat where you have a virtual coffee or a virtual beer or whatever, if you're having that conversation and learning stuff that you then say, oh, geez, we really should have known that, then that's something that you need to fix, right? That's something that you want to try to engineer your organization to avoid in the first place. So it's the horizontal transparency isn't really about saying, well, we know everything about everything, or we understand all of the data that's regulated that we shouldn't be able to see, because we know enough that we understand each other and we're all on the same page about what we're trying to do, and we're not trying to duplicate effort, and we have good lines of communication for talking to each other when we need to, which might be every day or once every 6 months. So you need some mechanisms, like some really simple mechanisms for defining how you're going to, what you can share and what you're not going to share, which can be really simple heuristics, right? It's not about having a book of rules. It's about having some simple heuristics and people using common sense for the most part. As long as that common sense is underpinned by a culture of, hey, we want people to know what's going on and we want to make sure that we understand what's happening. So, there might be a whole bunch of data about a detail about a tender that you just can't put out there. It's commercial in confidence. At the same time, you can probably tell people that there's a tender going on in this space. And there's stuff we can't tell you for these reasons. So have a think about, so if you start answering another one, then you're probably going to want to at least talk to us, and we're going to want to share whatever information we can to make sure that we're not in conflict or whatever it might be. We're not both going for the same tender in two different ways. So, you want to make sure you're sharing that information as much as you can. There's good reasons that, there's a lot of public servants that I know who would say, look, if we share this information, then the media is going to get a hold of it, and it's going to set everything back 2 years, because we're going to just be responding to media beat ups rather than actually progressing the work of looking after the public. And that's a perfectly reasonable concern, right? But what it can lead to is a culture where nobody tells anyone anything, which is going too far down that road. So it's about enabling your people to make their own sensible decisions at the right time.
I think radical transparency as a concept is I think it was never a good idea. It sounds kind of funky. It grabs the headlines. It's a bit of clickbait, but it's not a realistic concept in any sort of even within any sort of relationship. You don't want to be absolutely transparent about everything. There are certain things about your partner you don't necessarily want to know.
Let me just stop you there, because we've got a question, and I'm just going to jump it up on the screen because it just lines up with what you were just starting to talk about. So continue on, but I think we can answer this question for you.
Radical transparency within any organisation, any sort of reasonably sized organisation, you can't be transparent about everything, because everyone will just drown in information. There's just too much going on. What you can do is make sure that people have the right information at the right time in the right format to do their job. So at the teams level, the teams need to know what's going on that will impact or influence what they're doing. So how, dependencies and all that good stuff. At the management layer, you need to know what's going on in the other areas. Oh, you're working on a data platform, or maybe I don't need to work on a data platform as well. And at the strategic, the senior leadership level, you need to know how the strategic intent's being implemented. So you need the vertical and the horizontal at the right level and at the right volume, the right information, not all the information, because you end up just drowning in the lake of information, which is not a good thing.
I call it, I talk to it these days. I think about it as practical transparency, because I think you have to be practical about what you can share. But I think the other thing with it is that you can be transparent about the transparency that you can't give. So it's a bit of a time, right? So if you can't tell you that, really honestly transparent that we can't share this information, and normally organisations, I think the other part to that answer that question, and then I'll shut up, James, and you can have your two, Bob. is that we here at Remote AF, and the three of us are all guides and co-creators. We talk about the zone of transparency and expanding that zone of transparency in the right way, both vertically and horizontally. So I think there was a pointed thing that you said in there, David. I don't want to lose it in the grist. It's the right information at the right time in the right place, but it's ensuring that what people think is the right information is challenged. So often there will be information held at the middle layer of the organization. We call that enabling, enhancing, group layer, whatever you want to call that, right? Because they feel that that's not the information needed. But however, when you challenge that, actually the people doing the work really do need that traditional information, right? And I think that answers that how do you be transparent without turning your organization into a big slip, not the data edition, as escalates us. James, you got thoughts on that?
I love that question. And the answer is I don't think you can. If you go for radical transparency, you're very likely to have that unless you have a very select group of people who are very comfortable in that kind of environment. So generally, I don't try for it. Try for practical transparency. And I think it's key that you just have clear heuristics about what should we be transparent about. I remember working in an organization where a new CEO came in, and he sat down and said, right, folks, get everyone together. Had a lot of meetings with all of the leaders, had a lot of meetings with the whole of the organization, and just said, here's the strategy. Here's what the strategy is. Here's why we need it. Here's what'll happen if we don't. Here's what'll happen if we do. I need everyone to jump in and help out. That's not secret. That's not hard to do. Most CEOs don't. But it worked really well. Got everyone on board and everyone started pulling in the same direction. So it's not about like secret tools or it's not about radical transparency. It's just about being upfront and honest about the things that sometimes people decide they haven't got the time to be upfront and honest about, or they think that you just need to tell the layer below them in the hierarchy about it, or report up one layer. It's about bringing people together vertically, horizontally across the organization to tell them the important things. And it just takes some insight to understand what's important. And when you can't trust that you've got that insight right, which is perfectly reasonable, pull people together and say, hey, we think we're doing this. What about you? My project's doing these things. What about yours? Or my boss is an idiot. What about yours? Let's talk about what they don't know and how we're going to fix that. Have those conversations. It can be fun and easy. It doesn't need to be, it's not secret sauce. It's really just about having the conversations or finding ways to share the information. Some kind of obeya construct is really useful. Getting to know the people around your organization is really useful. So if you don't know them, and say you're working from one country and half of them are working from another country, well, set up some 15-minute conversations to get to know each other. Those kind of things are really useful.
Yeah, I tend to talk about it as being, it's not radical transparency, but radical translucency. So being really intentional about what you share and what you don't. So radical transparency is basically, walking around in your house in front of the windows with the blinds open and no clothes on. You're sharing everything with the world, and nobody wants to see that. Radical translucency is more about being intentional about what you're sharing, so that you're sharing the right thing at the right time with the right people.
Did you see James and I both have a visceral?
Yeah, I know.
we can't unsee that nowadays. I agree with both of you, but I think I go a little bit harder on that as well. I think our job, or anybody watching this at the moment, if you're starting to look at this, we talk about governing the system as a whole, and our job as part of that is to peel away the layers of the onion that have grown up, or the organizational detritus, right? And I think that is one of the killers of transparency. And what I mean by that is if you look at it from, the vertical flow of information, and both of them, and those connective tissues that allow that information flow often have many, many blockages. So you'll have steering committees in the middle. You'll have reporting that people just report because they've always reported because that report's necessary to do, but nobody actually reads it. Well, there's an information in it, right? And it's actually having the wherewithal to bring the people together and go, do we really need this? Are you using this? Is this just another way of straining the information so that we're actually creating this white static that organisationally people know it's not worthwhile? Right? It's like, can we remove a steering committee and can we replace that with an all hands? Can we have mechanisms that allow us to make those decisions and be very transparent about it? So I think it's inherent upon us as we work with organisations to challenge the status quo of those things, because
100%.
it's not just the people, it's the mechanisms that were even set up before those people even came in, probably. Thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much sort of legacy process cruft hanging around organisations. The report that gets produced that no one's read in 20 years, but it still gets produced. All of that stuff absolutely goes on. And one of our roles as guides is to challenge that stuff. So when you're in an organisation, well, you say you can't share that. Why can't you share this? Do we need that particular thing? Is there a better way of setting this up? I think that's really the role of a guide, is to do that challenging, because often an organisation is so in the system that they can't see the need to challenge it. It's, this is the way we do things. This is the way we've always done things. It works. Look at this. It's great. You often need that challenge from outside, and that's why people bring in guides and consultants and coaches and so on, is to be challenged.
Yeah.
And of course they get upset when you challenge them, but that's a different story.
Yeah. I'd like to credit Esther Derby and her concepts of, you've got the triangle of people at the bottom who know what's going on the ground, and you've got the triangle of people on the top who understand the strategy, and what you want to do is have this little diamond get bigger and bigger in the middle, so we actually have clear understanding of both as much as possible. We have a really decent and deep understanding of the strategy for the people who are doing the work, and we have a deep understanding of what's actually going on with the work for the people who are creating the strategy. And another thing Esther said is transparency is one of the key differences between a boss and a leader. So actually explaining what's going on and making sure that your people understand is a really key thing for a leader. And if you're coaching leaders or senior leaders, or if you're teaching them, then that's one of the key things to focus on as well, is get out of the weeds of making sure people are doing the right things, make sure people understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and then get out of their way, because it turns out people that you're working with are adults, pretty good at making decisions once they have enough of an understanding. So yes, make sure that you are challenging, as you say, Tony. Make sure that you are, depending on the organisation that you're going into. If it's a large organisation that's been around a long time, there's very likely a whole lot of this organisational detritus of constructs that exist because they exist at this point, and that needs to be challenged. If you're going to have a really lasting impact, then you're teaching the people that you're coaching to challenge those things when they find them. So they're not just removing the things that you notice while you're there, but they're continuing to remove blockages or reports that don't achieve anything as much as they possibly can, and the organisation itself starts to move towards depending more on Obeya constructs, more on live sharing of data and information, and less on reporting in committees. So I think you're absolutely right. It's key to challenge that, and it's key to try to grow a culture where everybody challenges that constructively as often as possible.
Yeah, I like that, James. And I think there's a key question that I like to use, whether it be senior leaders, whether it be the people doing the work, whatever. Mm-hmm. I tend to work my way through the layers, and it really is, what is the information you need to make the directional decisions in your day to allow you to move forward? And if you ask that at each of those layers, it's a very interesting construct in the end, because then you have a construct to have a conversation with the group to say, okay, you said you need this and you need this and you need this. Are you getting it?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you getting more than what you need? Or is this the white noise static creating the fact that you can't see that information for the weeds, right? Because that's always the interesting thing. Or are you spending more of your time having to spend your time in the meetings, and it's that stuck in execution thing that we talk about a lot, is you're spending a lot of time in the grist and in the mist because you haven't addressed this. You're actually attending 33,000 meetings to try and get your hands around this kind of thing. Which is on that team.
Yeah. I agree with you. I agree with you. Yeah, one of the reasons organisations get stuck in execution is because they don't have a system of transparency. So leaders lose sight of where's the strategic intent being executed. So they fall back on, well, I have to be in the status report meetings, which sticks the whole organisation into execution. It means that the leaders are focused on the detail of the work and not on the steering and on all of those things that we've talked about before.
And I think, James, one of the things that I love that you brought to the table when we were looking at the governing of the system of work, is those principles of governance, and I lean back on those a lot because they actually fly with transparency in a number of different things. But essentially, if you're asking the question, decide who needs to decide when to decide how to decide, and decide what to decide. Now, they seem like really simple questions, but they're very powerful when you're talking about transparency because they actually govern the transparency in its own right. Thoughts, James? It's one of your passions, I know.
Yeah. So, what is it? What are the decisions that we have? What are the decisions that are, I guess, a really good approach is when I take in these questions and talk to, say, senior leaders in an organisation who are saying, I'm always in these committee meetings. Well, in that case, all right, let's sit down and say, well, what are you deciding in those meetings? Sometimes they say, well, nothing. Okay, well, then stop having it. But if they are making a whole lot of decisions in those meetings, what you want to be trying to do is encourage those decisions to go further down towards the actual work that's getting done and enabling your people to make those decisions, except where they really are sensible decisions to centralise. And in those cases, you want to centralise them as much as possible outside the construct of a meeting. But go through them and say, what sort of decisions are you making? Okay, then, how are you making them? Why are you making them? So what's the logic that you're using in order to decide this? And say, well, look, we're just trying to make the decision that's cheapest while maintains quality, or we're trying to make the decision that has the best impact on our people, and or we're trying to say, how do we maintain our market edge? Whatever the rationale might be. So that's sort of how are you making the decisions? What's the logic that you're using? Okay, well, why are you making the decisions and why are you making them now? So it's like, well, I need to make this decision, and sometimes there's a really good reason, in which case you can start to talk about, all right, you're the right person to make the decision. So you got the who should decide. How do you make it easier for yourself? Sometimes it's like, well, they don't have the knowledge, or they don't have the understanding that I've got. Well, okay, then change that, change that so they don't have to wait. Because while some people will sit and say, to start with, when you start challenging these things, people say, oh, hey, it's above my pay grade to make that decision. And that's also quite reasonable, right? It's like, hey, I'm here to do the work. It's their job to make some of these decisions. It's what they're paid for. But sometimes equally, you're sitting here saying, I'd like to get this work done, but I have to wait for a committee. So challenge people to be prepared to make decisions. Challenge people to be prepared to delegate decisions, and say, well, why can't you? And then if all of that is clear and you say, all right, well, look, it doesn't seem like there's any reason that you needed to have this committee meeting to do this. Well, then great. It's let's move that decision down, but make that really explicit, right? We need to have a decision tree, or we need to have a construct that talks about, well, who makes what decisions? What is the logic that you're going to use? And also, as you mentioned, Tony, when? Sometimes the right idea is to make the decision as soon as possible. Sometimes the right idea is to make it the last responsible moment. Sometimes it's sort of somewhere in between. But and often, if you can move, say, decisions around, for example, what software architecture are we going to use to solve a particular problem? If you can make that decision by, say, the software developer or the tech lead on the team or whatever it might be, if they can make that decision without needing to go to an architectural committee, saves them a month, and they can decide when to make that decision. They can make it at the right time for them. So you've got to go through the thinking about decisions. Usually you can do a lot of this in a couple of workshops, right? You would pull the right people together for a workshop, get all of that information onto a great big whiteboard, and then start to turn it into a decision-making framework, and then refine it in a second workshop, and with the people who you're trying to move some decisioning to, and you've got a pretty good outcome where you've freed up a whole lot of time, you've removed a couple of committees, and people are starting to be pretty excited about and feel that new culture, because they're feeling that they're being entrusted to make decisions, or they're feeling that their leaders are feeling like, I've got time. I've had some stuff taken off me in a way that I've done some good leadership where I've empowered my people, and now I've got time to talk to them and make sure everyone's doing well. Do that leadership, not that bossing.
Yeah. I think one of the things we find with leaders is it's amazing how, at the lower levels of an organisation, everyone says, I'm not empowered to make that decision. But as you go up the organisation, everybody says, I'm not empowered to make that decision. In a room full of CEOs, and they're all saying, if only I had the power to make a decision, but I'm answerable to the board. I was working with a financial institution, talking to their whole C-suite, and they were talking about changing the incentive structure to be more team-based and less individual-based. And they said, if only we could make this decision. So, well, who do you need? You're the CEO.
Yeah.
And they said, well, we need finance. Well, CFO's sitting over there. We need HR, chief people officer sitting there. Can you make the decision? Well, I went, actually, I think we can make this decision now. People learn that they can't make decisions. And they carry that with them right up into very senior levels of leadership. There's this assumption, we can't make that decision. We need to talk about it in a committee or have more people in there or whatever it might be. Actually, a lot of the time, if you challenge that, we can make this decision now.
Yeah.
I also really love the last responsible moment thing. And what people often forget is that the last responsible moment can be right now. It's actually really urgent, and we can't defer this one. The last responsible moment was last week.
Yeah.
And our options are being progressively narrowed as we go further past
We'd better go for the next least irresponsible moment.
That's right.
Yeah, I like it. It's really is that challenge in the way we always did it stuff, right? And it's interesting. I was in a session with executive leaders, and had the executive leader who was in charge, then all the direct reports, governmental structure, and the thing that was raised when we were talking about this transparency. One of them said, "Well, this is all tied to levels of delegation." And so, who's the top executive leader, they have to make all those decisions because that's their delegation, and we can't make those decisions. And it was an interesting challenge because that executive leader had a light bulb moment and said, well, yes, I do, but I can actually give you the guide rails to make decisions. And when you need to come to me, that still doesn't stop me from making the decisions that I need to make. And that's changing that culture.
There are some decisions I need to make as a leader, but that doesn't mean I have to make all the decisions.
This is it.
And again, coming back to the transparency piece, if you're clear about the delegation and the guide rails and all of those sort of things, then people know the limits. If you don't have that culture of transparency around that, everyone assumes I can't make that decision. I'm going to go to the boss. And then they go, I don't know whether I can make that decision or not. I'm going to go to my boss. And everything ends up with the CEO, who spends all their time making operational decisions and not being a CEO.
Yeah. I got a lovely question here. And the question is around culture. You've talked a lot about culture, but how do we go about changing the culture? Nice question. Unfortunately, I can't tell who it is. You're coming through as just a LinkedIn user, but that's okay. LinkedIn user, we're happy to answer that question. What's team?
Oh, it's easy. Easiest thing in the world is to change culture.
Not what we're looking for, I don't think, James.
I'm kind of joking, but seriously, if you're trying to change culture within an organization, you just start by behaving differently. You think about if you're a leader, you've got really strong influence over the culture, kind of below you in the hierarchy in most organizations, right? Like some organizations are built differently, but most of the time you've got a pretty strong influence. And so think about how you can influence the culture downwards from you by, first of all, I gave the example before of the CEO coming in and saying, here's the new strategy. I'm going to sit down with everybody in the whole organization and talk about it and explain why it matters. That's a really strong driver of a new culture. Right? It's not enough to do it by itself, but it's a really good example to get started on changing a culture. If you've got to think about the systems that you have in place and the reward systems, like if you've got really strong bonus systems that pit people against each other, then you're not encouraging transparency. So you've got to think about all of those kinds of things. And you can look across the organization and see there's like everyone saying one thing but doing another, or you're not going to have a great culture. But if you can model the behavior you want to see, and if you can be right up front about it and say, I'd like to change the culture here, I want it to be more transparent. So I want to hear from you, and I want to be talking to people, and don't just say my door is always open. Everyone says my door is always open. Go out there and actually engage with people. Knock on their door and say hello. Make the time to actually have the conversations with people. Make the time to find the simple ways to change that culture. Like, for instance, perhaps at the moment we have a once a month social get together that 5 people go to and drink heavily, and that's it, and everybody else just doesn't attend. We'll change that and make it something that's during work hours that engages people in the way they want to be engaged. So maybe it's a gaming session or something. Maybe there's a whole lot of
family
stuff
picnic or something.
Yeah,
picnic. Make it whatever is going to be something that people actually want to do. And make it so as it's not outside of work hours and all the people who have family can't attend. If you're trying to encourage cultural change, then be upfront about it. Ask people what they would like to do and how they think you could help change the culture. Do those things. It's not easy, but it starts with actually making simple efforts.
Thoughts, Dave?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's a massively overused cliche, but be the change you want to see is it's a cliche for a reason. It's real. People look to their leaders for cues on how to behave, and if you're behaving in a particular way, then they'll behave in that way.
Mm-hmm.
You often see leaders saying one thing but doing another. We need to save money. We need to save money, and then a fancy new chair arrives for their office. Or they're always flying business class, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
You've got to role model the change that you want to see. The other thing, if you're not a leader in an organisation, challenge. If you're a coach, if you're a guide, if you're whatever, challenge the culture that's there, challenge the assumptions that people have around why we do things. We can't share that. Why can't we share that? Why can't we be transparent about this? Why can't we make this decision? I think asking those questions and doing it in a respectful and decent way is a way of challenging and changing culture.
Yeah. I think one of our colleagues, Dave McKenzie, has a favourite saying, which I do. Cultural transparency is only a set of behaviours that you accept or model. Yep. And I think that wraps up exactly what we're saying there. And in terms of wrapping up, gentlemen, we are at the end of our time, and it's been a fantastic conversation. And James's dog has come to say goodbye as well, which is fantastic.
Bailey wanted to jump in about transparency, but I guess we're out of time. Sorry, kid.
Well, the show's gone to the dogs. Right. Okay. Yeah. Don't forget, join us at remoteaf.ca, click the community button, and join them.
Well, James gets eaten by his dog.
And you can talk with James's dog as well. Or don't
Really?
also big announcement coming from the Remote AF team very shortly. Keep an eye out for that. You'll see the announcements. Something's been simmering and cooking in the background. And join our Teamcraft newsletter. You can register all the details in the show notes. Been fantastic to have you again, team. And we will, of course, be back with another episode of this and another one of the pillars of governance. Dave Martin, James McMennamin, it's been fantastic to have you. Thank you for being on it.
Haley Chain. Thank you, Tony. Appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure.